but the events in the Middle East often send me to the book of Genesis and to the story of Abraham and Sarah, whose home was in modern day Iraq before God so boldly intruded himself into their lives. Geography alone makes their story particularly compelling and timely, but even more than that, one could argue that the difficulties which Jews and Christians have with Muslims today can be traced to Abraham's two sons. Ishmael, understood to be the progenitor of Arabs, and Isaac, progenitor of Jews. In the story today, the oppressive barrenness which has dominated the history of Abraham and Sarah is finally broken, with results that are cause both for rejoicing and for heartache. Although they were once very human little boys who lived a long, long time ago, Ishmael and Isaac live on today as powerful metaphors which confront us with a radical choice. Are we willing to trust completely in that surprising and totally unpredictable grace of God, which alone makes all things new? Or do we continue to hang on tightly to those securities of our own devising, which is to settle for barrenness? Now, the book of Genesis is in some sense an anthology containing narratives by splendid writers who should have fired their editor. Plainly enough, the 17th chapter belongs with the 21st. So let me begin with the 17th in an effort to sort out our choice of ancestors. When Abraham was 99 years old, God appeared to him and reiterated a promise he had made on more than one occasion during the past decade, but there was an important difference this time. The land of Canaan was to belong to Abraham and his descendants in perpetuity. As a sign of Abraham's faithfulness to God, and as a physical mark distinguishing them as belonging to God's special people, circumcision was that religious ritual through which God's ownership was acknowledged, and that was more than merely an indication of belonging. We've had occasion to say in other connections that baptism is the New Testament equivalent, the sacramental act by which we say, I am no longer my own, I belong to God. So let me repeat in case you've forgotten it. Baptism is to Christians what circumcision is to Jews. Now, evidently, Abraham had no problem with any of that and readily agreed to it. But God then went on to tell him again that soon Sarah would bear a son, whereupon Abraham's feet flew right out from under him and he fell on his face laughing. When he dusted himself off, he said, look, I've already got a son, an heir, whose name is Ishmael. Let's just settle for him. Ishmael, you remember, was Abraham's son by Hagar, Sarah's Egyptian maid, an arrangement she had proposed in order to help God out, since he seemed incapable of fulfilling his promise. But God said, no, I have plans for Ishmael too, but the promise will be fulfilled only through Isaac. And better to understand the torturous events soon to follow, we need to keep that promise in front of us. And here it is. At the beginning of this incredible story, which nobody could have possibly made up out of whole cloth, God said to Abraham, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you, I will curse. And in you, all of the families of the earth shall be blessed." And that's the heart of it. In you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. And the heart of that is the word bless, at the root of which is the Anglo-Saxon word blood. The rudimentary definition of bless is to consecrate with blood. To consecrate is to set apart for a holy purpose. And that is holy, which comes from or belongs to God. Now, are you still with me? For reasons all his own, one could surely be forgiven for wondering about the wisdom of them. But for reasons all his own, God elects to work through human agency. And further, for reasons all his own, God chose the Hebrews, beginning with an unlikely pair named Abraham and Sarah, entered into a covenant with them, and through them his ownership of all life and that stunning grace and mercy which sustain it were to be communicated to all people. In you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Ishmael shall also become a great nation, but my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this season next year. And lo and behold, 25 years after the promise was first made, Sarah did just that. They named the baby Isaac, of course, Yitzhak, which in Hebrew means to laugh. And Sarah said, "God has brought laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me." This is Walter Brueggemann's insight. By his powerful word, God has broken the grip of death, hopelessness, and barrenness. The joyous laughter is the end of sorrow and weeping. Laughter is the biblical way of receiving a newness which cannot be explained. But in fact, the laughter didn't last long. And here's the reason why. A newness which cannot be explained is not always the most welcome event in one's life. It brings with it the disturbing news that there is another reality beyond the prosaic pedestrian reality to which all our protests against it we quickly grow comfortable and accustomed. The birth was clearly one which could not be explained by any natural process. Abraham and Sarah were indeed as good as dead, as the writer to the Hebrews described them. So miraculous was this birth that Paul compared it to the creation of the world out of nothing. He even intimated that it is a foretaste of the resurrection. Abraham had to be 100 and Sarah had to be 90, lest they and we suppose that the heir was their doing rather than God's. The essence of faith is precisely the affirmation that human potential contains within it no basis for hope, none whatsoever, and that God alone has the power to break into our barrenness with new life. The birth of Isaac turns us away from any notion that the present is ours to control and the future ours to shape, to a singular and total reliance upon God, who alone is faithful. That both we and God cannot shape the future, and that is acted out in the troubling events which soon follow Isaac's birth. In an unbecoming fit of anger, Sarah insisted that Ishmael had to go. The right reason, if for the right decision, if for entirely the wrong reason. One day, while watching the boys play together, Sarah's jealousy of Hagar and her simmering resentment about an arrangement which she had herself proposed boiled over, and Sarah demanded that Abraham banish forever the all too visible and painful evidence of their human conniving. But Abraham flatly refused. He loved both his sons and saw no reason why he must choose between them. Now, we can sympathize with him totally in that, yet by now we can surely see beneath the surface of conflicting parental emotions to the deeper drama being played out. Abraham wants to have it both ways. The demands of grace are too radical, even for the father of faith happily to accept. But human conniving and God's grace are totally incompatible. There is the awful, troubling truth of the matter. Ishmael must go. God loves and cares for him too, but the promise must work itself out through Isaac. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for it is through Isaac that offspring shall be named for you. A piece of divine savagery that can hardly be equaled in any other part of Scripture is the way one outraged commentator put it. And he went on, God's solicitude at the end of the story is tenderly portrayed and mitigates the savagery of his earlier sentence of exclusion, but it can hardly be said to cancel it out. It is the consistent message of the Bible that the workings of God's grace are not only marvelous, but can be very perturbing, quite beyond our ability to understand. But what is so difficult to understand about the fact that Ishmael was none of God's doing in the first place? He was then and represents today the results of doubting God's promises and taking God's future into human hands. There is nothing savage in the decision at all, but rather grace, as we witness God working in complex situations and through imperfect human beings to accomplish God's purposes, which will be accomplished, I must report to you, whether with our concurrence or in spite of it. Someone else saw it this way. God works with the individuals on the scene. God does not perfect people before deciding to work through them. Sarah's strategy, however inadequate, may be seen by God as the best possible way into the future for this particular moment in the life of that family. The narrator writes superbly of the early morning preparations, of the completely inadequate supply of food and water, of the bewildered mother wandering into the wilderness, of her anguish and inability to watch her child die of thirst. Phyllis Tribble, an insightful Old Testament scholar, says that Hagar has become many things to many people, most especially all sorts of rejected women find their stories in her. She is the faithful maid exploited, the Black woman used by the male and abused by the female of the ruling class, the surrogate mother, the resident alien without legal recourse, the other woman, the runaway youth, the pregnant young woman alone, the expelled wife, the shopping bag lady carrying bread and water, the homeless woman, the indigent relying upon handouts from the power structures, the welfare mother, and the self-effacing female whose own identity shrinks in service to others. Tart of tongue, yes, she was known to be that. But if there is a victim in this story, it is Hagar. God heard her cry. Do you remember that the word Ishmael means God hears? And directed her to a well of water and promised that her son too would become a great nation. And he did. Today, in that same wilderness to which he was banished, there live nearly 1 billion Muslims who call Ishmael their father, to whom the descendants of Isaac are supposed to be a blessing. Brueggemann sums it up. God's act of deliverance occur out and about in the seemingly God-forsaken corners of the world. Here we see God at work among the outcasts, the refugees of the world, who fill our world as much as they did then. Persons of faith are to participate in their lives, to lift them up and hold them fast until the wells become available. These stories remind the chosen that their God is the God of all the world, including the outcasts. Well, the story is wondrous, but no less troubling, isn't it? And no one uses this tale to greater effect than the Apostle Paul in his letters to the Romans and the Galatians. The spin Paul puts on it would undoubtedly come as quite a surprise to the one who wrote it. Nevertheless, the early church recognized in Hagar, Ishmael, and Sarah, Isaac, two powerful theological symbols. The one representing human presumption and coercion, and the other representing God's freedom and destiny. The issue in the Galatian letter is the way in which our alienated relationship with God is restored. Paul insisted that there is but one way: to trust alone in that stunning grace of God demonstrated in the incarnation, crucifixion, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. The Galatians said, no, that can't possibly be all there is. We must also keep the Mosaic law and certain of the ceremonial and culinary rituals. But that is to suppose that there is something we can do to merit God's grace, Paul countered. When we diminish that grace by insisting upon our additives and supplements, then Christ has died in vain. If there is anything at all we can do to enhance our stature in the eyes of God, then the cross has lost its point and purpose. For it is written that Abraham had two sons, one by a slave woman and the other by a free woman. One, the child of the slave, was born according to the flesh, born in the usual way, as another translation has it. The other, the child of the free woman, was born through the promise. The usual way ought to be a way familiar enough to most of us, the way of doubt, of impatience, of an unwillingness to trust promises the fulfillment of which are beyond our imagining, of taking matters into our own hands and living life on our own terms. Such as follow that way are the descendants of Ishmael, who lives on as a metaphor for all our efforts to control the present and shape the future. But there are others who are able to navigate their way through the perilous complexities and ambiguities of life, confronting the absurdities and defeating them, because they are guided and upheld by the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. They are the descendants of Isaac, for they have been encountered by that grace, which alone can break through the barrenness of those as good as dead and make all things new. Your choice of ancestors. Now, I hope that when you see, hear, read about the mess in the Middle East, when you see Muslim extremists slaughtering people on the streets, whatever, that you wonder a little bit about this incredible story of Hagar and Ishmael and Sarah and Isaac. Do you ever wonder such things? I disappeared. There's Mary.
Here, I'm back. Well, I wonder how the story is told in Muslim countries. I knew once, but I don't anymore. I mean, our story just kind of dismisses Ishmael and says, God will take care of you, just, go. But here our main story is back with Abraham and Isaac. But what is their story?
I do not know, and I would like to know. I just wonder if Arab families rehearse that story. I don't know. Does anybody?
Mm-mm.
Well, one thing that I do think is notable is that in Islam, the story of the Akedah is about Ishmael, not Isaac.
Right.
So, I mean, they center Ishmael over Isaac in most of the Abraham stories.
Mm.
Sandra posed the rudimentary question during dinner, which creates indigestion, but this time it was quite on target, I thought. So if I could get her in here.
Well,
That's kind of, I had to write it down to that would Islam have been avoided had Sarah not directed Abraham to Hagar? And where would we be if that action had never happened and that Ishmael was born?
And
Or what if he hadn't been sent away?
we have Arabs galore.
Are they all descendants of Ishmael?
So,
I'm
I
good.
mean, I know that the source is not ideal, but if you look up what Muslim literature has to say about Ishmael on Wikipedia, it can give you the beginning of some great resources for beginning to like maybe do your own research. But one of the things it mentions here that I find interesting as someone who has not done a ton of research on this is that according to a lot of Muslim literature, Abraham and Ishmael stayed in close contact for the rest of their lives. So it says here, Abram returned and visited Ishmael at various times throughout his life. At one time, according to the tradition of Muhammad, Abraham arrived when his son was out and he visited with Ishmael's wife. So the idea is that they aren't separated for all time, which is interesting.
Yeah.
But again, I'm no expert.
Like that.
I spent a lot more time studying Hinduism than Islam when I was in seminary. Looks like we just got Jack back. Jack, you are muted. Let's see. Try one more time, buddy. There we go.
Ishmael and Isaac got together one last time to bury Abraham. And I think that was the last time the two brothers saw each other. But I think it's a fascinating thing to wonder, pointless to wonder, but fascinating that if that had not happened, would there be an Arab nation? And I find it difficult sometimes not to generalize the negative when a Muslim fundamentalist does some dastardly deed. It's just so easy to generalize the negative, knowing I'm sure that's nowhere near the typical Muslim attitude.
Yeah.
No, is anybody there? Hello.
We're here.
Thinking.
Well,
I can have positive vibes about Muslims. I think Muslims are peace loving. They call their God Allah. But just like any branch, any group, there can be militants involved. And they color the group.
well, they do.
So I think,
And
I mean, yeah, I just think Muslims can be good like Christians can be good. And we have our faith, we have our God, we have our traditions, we have our stories. It's the militant, dangerous ones that don't get it.
they seem to have an attitude that Allah cannot take care of himself. So that anytime there's any sort of perceived insult to Allah, cartoon, book, whatever, they've got to go charging off and slaughter somebody to defend Allah. That's a peculiar sort of God, it seems to me. And why I find it very difficult to hear anybody say, you know, well, there's only one God and we're all going to the same place and so on and so on. Well, God, our God, and Allah are not one and the same at a number of significant points, just not.
Hmm.
Well, there's one more thing that I want to talk to you for just a minute about, and that is the book of Galatians. Ishmael per se is never mentioned in the New Testament, but Hagar is, and the 4th chapter of Galatians, the verses I suggest you read, is one of the most prominent. But I want to remind you of what I'm sure you know or have heard about Galatians. After his conversion, Paul did not seek the approval of the mother church, namely Jerusalem, which was presided over. Sarah, am I being heard or not?
Yes.
You're being heard,
Yep.
but there you go.
After Paul's conversion, there were those probably who expected him to go straight to Jerusalem and receive the approbation by a number of the original apostles who were presiding over what was already understood to be the mother church. But 3 years later, he did go to Jerusalem and spent 15 days with Peter, explaining to Peter his call to preach to the Gentiles a gospel which did not require them, in effect, to become Jews before they became Christians, absolving them in particular of the obligation of circumcision and the endless dietary laws. Sometime later, Peter decided to visit Antioch and see the largely Gentile congregation there. And remember now, that's Paul's base of operation. And for a time, Peter enthusiastically got with the Gentile program. He had bacon for breakfast and the works, until a delegation arrived from Jerusalem for a visit, whereupon Peter reverted to everything Jewish, leading Paul to oppose him to his face, publicly calling him a hypocrite. Now, can you imagine at a family night dinner in Antioch, Paul stands up and calls Peter a hypocrite? Meanwhile, the Galatian Christians had relapsed and believed again that salvation came through works of the law rather than through faith. So Paul absolutely exploded. And his letter is an attempt to bring them back to the gospel as Paul understood it. And one of the ways he attempted to do that was to create an allegory comparing Hagar, a slave woman, and her son, vis-a-vis Sarah, a free woman, and her son. Now, it is by any measure a tortured allegory understood only by Paul. The commentators, even the very best of them, since they're paid to explain everything, go on and on and on and on. And instead, they simply should say, these verses make no sense. But they labor on and on in an effort to explain it. Maybe you got the point of it. I have tried repeatedly through the years and never have. But that's what's going on in that Galatian letter, which contains some of the most powerful and significant stuff that Paul ever wrote. Looking ahead to next week for just a minute, we'll be dealing with what some people today find the most troubling thing anywhere in the Bible, or one of the two most troubling, and that is the sacrifice of Isaac. You've got that in the Old Testament, and of course the sacrifice of Jesus in the New. And there are many who simply discount anything like a gracious God who would have anything to do with either of those. So you're familiar with that story, certainly, but read it again afresh, think through what's going on there. How in the world can you understand that, let alone defend it? Raise the problem, theodicy. That's a word you haven't yet today, but TEODOCY, which is defending the goodness of God in the face of evil. How do you do that? And could God not have made whatever the point was in some other less dramatic and gruesome fashion? But I think underneath it all, if we can get to it without being so repulsed that we avoid it altogether, we will discover that the story is telling us that only that which we are willing to give up to God is ours to keep.